Okay, so possibly one of my biggest pet peeves in audio is this idea that you need to listen to an IEM or a headphone for hours on end to have an understanding of it and to be able to give a good opinion of it. This is simply not true, and if it is true for you, then it means that you have a listening problem. And that's totally okay, because that's where I started out too when I first started listening to IEMs like 5, maybe going on 6 years ago at this point. You know, I would listen to IEMs for hours on end, and I would have no idea what I just heard or how to communicate what I had heard or why I liked one IEM more than another one. Honestly, that was part of the motivation behind why I wanted to become a reviewer. This was something that I actively wanted to work on getting better at. But you know how the saying goes, give a man a fish and he eats for a day. Teach a man how to fish and he eats for life. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing in this video for you guys. I'm going to be teaching you how to fish or how to listen critically. The reality is that you could be reading reviews all day long. You could be reading my reviews even, but you could get an IEM and think it sounds like horse shit, even if I think it sounds very good. And basically what this video is intended to do is to give you the tools to, one, gauge sound quality on your own, and then two, build the confidence to articulate what you're hearing and why you like or dislike something. A question you might have though is why you'd want to learn to listen critically in the first place. After all, what happened to just enjoying the music? I think this is a sentiment that is thrown around quite often in the audio community. And my answer to this is that yes, ignorance is bliss. It can be bliss to a degree. However, the more invested you are in audio, the more you like listening to good music and good sound, the more it behooves you to build your ability to listen critically. And the reason for this is kind of multifold. One, if you learn to listen critically, you're going to learn and understand your preferences better. If you understand your preferences better, you are going to be able to, one, save time when you're listening to new IEMs, and then two, save money because you're going to buy the IEMs that you actually like and think sound good. And then three, if you buy IEMs that sound good and that you like, your music is also going to sound better in the end, and you're going to enjoy it more. So don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with enjoying the music, but you could be enjoying it more if you knew how to listen critically. Now, with all that being said, let's define what I mean when I say listen critically. At a high level, I think of critical listening as a listener's ability to listen to an IEM and then to represent as accurately as possible what they heard in terms of frequency response. And obviously there's a lot more that goes into the overall sound of an IEM and how we would describe what we're hearing. But again, keeping this high level, I think that frequency response is responsible for the majority of what we hear. And the most important thing is that frequency response is measurable and repeatable. And when it comes to getting better at something, that's absolutely something that we need. We need something that we can anchor our level of competency to. And so what I'm going to be doing in this video is I'm going to be giving you 3 core avenues for which you can learn to listen for frequency response and to build confidence in what you are hearing. Okay, so the first method I'm going to be talking about is probably the more traditional method, and it's the way most established reviewers built their listening ability, and that's really just by hearing a ton of IEMs and then gauging what they've heard against the measurement of that IEM. Like, one of my favorite flexes, honestly, is that I've heard personally over 500 IEMs, and while that definitely sounds very impressive, the amount of bearing that actually has on my listening ability is pretty much fucking zero. It doesn't matter at all. And just to put this into perspective, I will use an analogy, which is the gym. If your goal is to build like muscle and you go to the gym and you run on the treadmill for 5 hours every day, you're never going to build a shred of muscle. And it's the same principle if you go to the gym and you do all the correct exercises, but your diet is shit, you're still never going to build a shred of muscle. Like maybe you might build a little bit, but it's going to be suboptimal, the amount of muscle that you're building. Building listening ability basically functions on these same principles. It doesn't really matter how many IEMs you've heard if you don't listen to them correctly. Okay, so high level, how does this method work? Like I said, you would listen to one IEM and then you would go and look at its frequency response and try and correlate that to what you just heard. So the other way this method works, of course, is by having IEMs that you can compare between. And of course, you would compare them both in ear and on the frequency response charts. Okay, so what I'll show you guys now is how I would actually implement this method into practice. So one of your best resources is going to be squig.link, which was developed by Super Review. And this is such a great resource that aggregates a ton of frequency response measurements. It's pretty much the go-to site for this. And you'll see that the first time you hop on this here, it's going to give you a little introduction to what frequency response is and how you'd want to read it. And I think that it just breaks it down in a very simple, easy to understand manner. So highly recommend reading through this if it's your first time. And then in addition to that, if you want to know more about how to read frequency response, I will link some other resources that you can take a look at as well. Now, with that being said, I have two IEMs here. One is my Moondrop Variations, and the other is the Elysian Annihilator. And so what I would do first is I would listen to these two IEMs without looking at the measurements. And the reason for that is, one, it's just good practice not to lead the witness and to prime yourself to think a certain way by seeing the measurements first. And then two, I would also be writing impressions after I'd listened to both of these IEMs side by side. And then I would want to look at the measurements and gauge how accurately my impressions matched those actual measurements. So with that being said, let's assume that I've just listened to some music on both of these IEMs and I have written down my impressions of both of them. What I would do now is I would pull up the measurements on squig.link of these IEMs. And then as you can see here, this is going to depict the differences of these two IEMs in terms of frequency response. And as you get better, you're going to start understanding some of the differences that you're seeing here. So for one, the Annihilator has a much more emphasized bass shelf. However, at the same time, it is not necessarily a warmer IEM. And the reason for this being that it has an excess of presence from around 10 to 15k hertz, which in turn is going to kind of skew the balance, the overall balance of the Annihilator's tuning. And then something else you're going to notice here is that the Variations actually has more presence from around 800 hertz to around 2000 hertz. And what this means is that vocals are actually going to sound more forward on the Variations versus the Annihilator. And these are all associations that are going to take time to build. You're not going to get this right away. And what kind of complicates this, right, is that when you hear frequency response, you're hearing everything at once, all of these frequencies at once. And they kind of interact with each other in different ways. And that's kind of to my point earlier about why this is actually, the Annihilator is actually not a warmer listen than the Variations necessarily, because it has this extra presence in the upper treble. Another useful resource, if this is your first time looking at frequency response and you want to kind of bring a correlation between what you're seeing on the paper and what you're actually hearing, is an online tone generator or sine sweep generator. And this is probably my favorite one. I will link this again, but it'll let you just basically put in any frequency you want, let's say like 1000 hertz, and then you can play it. And that will give you a sense again of what you are hearing in terms of frequency. Again, actual instruments and actual sounds, they token a spectrum of frequencies, and this is just intended to give you a broad idea. And something else you can do is play around with an interactive chart like this one here. So this is particularly useful if you want to see where real instruments are tokening on the frequency spectrum. A pretty natural drawback of this method, of course, is that you are limited by the quantity of the IEMs that you can hear. And so in this respect, quantity does matter. In addition to this, it could be difficult to build up a more nuanced understanding of how individual peaks and dips kind of affect the rest of the frequency response. This is kind of a phenomenon known as auditory masking. So with that being said, a more nuanced approach to training your ear would be Harman's How to Listen program. So this is a program with many subsets of programs that you can use, but I think that the most useful one is probably the band ID training one. So to get this program, you literally just want to Google Harman's How to Listen, and it will be the first result that shows up. And you should have download links for both Mac OS and Windows OS. I'm not sure if the Mac OS one works, but the Windows one definitely does because I have it on my computer right now. Now, a feature that I really like about this program though is the fact that you can use your own music with it. It will let you load your own test tracks. And the reason this is important, of course, is because if you are actually listening on like a show floor, for example, with your music, this program will closely mimic that experience. And let's pop that open. This is what it's going to look like. And you're just going to go over here and click practice. And then if you go to program here, as you can see, I can choose the track that I want to listen to, and I can add my own music files as well. So we're just gonna click Start Practice Session, and you'll see it presents you with a flat version and an EQ'd version. And your job is to decide which band is being EQ'd. So in this case, it definitely sounds like, those upper treble ones are being altered. A limitation that you'll run into though, is if, like in my case here, I don't have a subwoofer hooked up, so I can't actually hear the frequencies under like 60 hertz or so. So it's either 1 or -2 right now, and I can't tell because I don't have a sub. I'm gonna say it's 1. Because the mid-range is a lot thinner, I think the bass has been cut out. But again, I can't really tell because I don't have a subwoofer that plays those frequencies. So as you can see, I just got the last one correct, and it has now added another band to the training. And the more you get correct, the more bands it will add, and in turn, this will increase the difficulty of the program. Personally, I think I did this program like 3 years ago, and I topped out at around 8 bands, which I would say is pretty decent. However, I've seen listeners pushing upwards of 12 to 15 bands. So make no mistake that the skill ceiling is very high for this program, and you can get pretty fucking good at identifying these peaks and dips if you put some time into it. Okay, so the final method that I'm going to outline for building up your listening ability is parametric equalization and just playing around with it. So if you don't know what this is, it is a digital tool that you can use to adjust individual frequencies to a very, very high granularity. The best way of describing this is that it's basically your playground to exploring frequency response. It will let you boost bass, tame treble, and pretty much change and transform the sound of any given IEM or headphone, provided you know what you're doing. So I think the difference between playing with parametric equalization and the aforementioned Harman How to Listen program mostly lies in the journey. When you're doing Harman's How to Listen program, you're probably not listening for enjoyment necessarily. You're trying to get better at identifying those peaks and dips. Whereas with parametric equalization, you are probably going to be playing around with your IEM or headphone to try and make it sound better at the same time. So I think, at least for me, there's a more enjoyable component to parametric equalization versus Harman's How to Listen program, which at most is a game for me. I try and turn it into a game where I try and see what the highest level I can get to is. And this is compared to parametric equalization, which I think has, in fact, an even higher skill ceiling and a higher enjoyment ceiling as well. So I would say that parametric equalization is kind of like the final boss when it comes to, learning your preferences and building your understanding of frequency response. It's mostly limited by the amount of time that you're willing to put into it and how much and how quickly you learn, I guess. Now, here's an interesting question, which is, assuming you have good listening ability, how long does it actually take you to assess an IM? And my answer to this, I think, is probably pretty similar to what someone like Clinical will tell you. And it's that I can tell whether an IM is broadly bad, okay, or good in under a minute or two. That's really all it takes. The really difficult part is ascertaining how good something actually is once you already know it's good. That can take a lot longer for me and others, I imagine, as well. With that being said, there are certainly techniques that you can use to expedite this process, so to speak. These are a bit more nuanced, but I'm going to be talking about them anyways, just because I do think that they make a difference the better you get at listening. So one of these things is going to be your choice of test tracks. Ideally, you would have a variety of test tracks that specifically test for various parts of the frequency spectrum, so bass, mid-range, treble, etc. So for this, the tracks that you want to be using are probably not the tracks that you think you should be using. And I say this in the sense that a lot of the music that is used by manufacturers at shows, for example, when they are showcasing headphones and whatnot, tends to be quite slow and kind of truncated in the lows or the very high frequencies. And the reason for this is that they will sound better on most systems and they will hide flaws. In an ideal world, the music that you should be using to test frequency response is usually brighter, faster paced, and just harsher in general, because this is going to be a lot more revealing of peaks and valleys in the frequency response of a given IM or headphone. I guess what I can do now is talk about some other common misconceptions when it comes to the music that you're listening to. For one, you really don't need to be listening to, high-res lossless music or anything like that. Obviously, it only serves to benefit you the higher quality your music is in terms of like the audio format, but I'd say like lossy stuff like 320 is perfectly acceptable, and the difference between that and lossless is just so subtle that it really does not matter in the grand scheme of things. Another common misconception might be the idea that you need to have heard instruments in real life before to gauge how they sound. The reality is that one, there's a lot of post-processing that takes place when a track is mastered, which is going to inherently just fuck around with what you actually hear in real life versus in the track. And then two, so if you have a baseline that measures flat as well, like the Genelec Studio monitors, for example, you can basically just listen to those instruments off of there, and then you can use that to identify the differences versus another transducer. One little thing that I'll point out is that the points that you're listening for in your test tracks, they should ideally be at the start of the track. And the reason for that is because your audible memory is highly fallible. I think it takes only like 6 seconds or something for you to start forgetting something. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, you really don't want to be wasting time re-scrubbing through to a particular point of a test track when all you could really be doing is just hitting the back button to restart the track again. Ultimately, I'm really delving into the nuances of the music that you can be listening to and how you can be listening to it. With that being said, the music that you should be using is the music that you're most familiar with. One, that's just by virtue of you being most comfortable with it and you knowing the music the best. But then two, that's probably going to be most representative of the music that you'd actually be listening to for enjoyment. So my final technique that I use to expedite my listening process is a comparison IM. And for me, that is the Moondrop Variations. So I like having a comparison IM for a couple of reasons. One, it's just to get a gauge of how good something else is very quickly. And then two, it can also act as a palate cleanser, so to speak, for your ears. If you've ever been to a show before and maybe it was your first one or something like that, or you've heard a lot of IMs or headphones in quick succession, then you'll probably know that it's quite easy to overwhelm your ears. Everything just starts sounding the same at some point, and what a comparison IM will let you do, an IM that you're very familiar with will let you do, is sort of reset your ears and get you back into the groove. Yeah, so I still have them here. So the reason why I like using these IMs is because they have a lot of contrast across the frequency spectrum. And by this, I mean that they have, one, an emphasized bass shelf, but then they have a dip at around 200 hertz. So you get a really good sense of what a sharp sub-bass shelf sounds like, one with like 10 decibels. And then moving into the mid-range, these have razor flat lower mids, and then they have a very conventional elevated notch at 3K hertz for the pinna compensation. And then moving into the treble, these IMs are pretty smooth, and at the same time, they're pretty well extended up until like maybe 17,000 hertz. It's a very good baseline for treble because you can identify, again, where peaks and dips are occurring on another IM by comparison. See, I really don't actually like to use an IM that measures flat as a comparison point, just because if you take an IM that measures flat versus the variation, which has more contrast, versus another IM that you're listening against, the differences that you're going to hear versus the variations are going to be a lot more pronounced versus, say, the Etymotic ER4XR, which is an IM that measures quite flat. Okay, so ultimately, I just want to say that listening ability is a skill that takes time and effort to build. It's not something that happens overnight. And in addition to that, your hearing is always going to be susceptible to your mood and external factors like the environment. For example, even with years of experience under my belt, when I do impressions at like trade shows and stuff, I always take them with a grain of salt, and you should too when you read my impressions, because there is a lot happening in the environment. Like, it's noisy. I've probably just slept maybe like 4 or 5 hours because I drove in the night before or something like that. And all of this affects my hearing and my impressions. In any event, I hope this video has given you some of the core resources that you need to build your listening ability. And as with anything else, guys, if you guys want to actually get good at this, don't just watch this video, you know? Like, watch this video and then go do the things that I am talking about. That is what is going to actually make you good at listening and allow you to build this critical listening ability. And yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in my next video. Peace out.